Okay, so we have different sources of bias. So we kind of mentioned some of these. So there's voluntary response bias. So this is more like what we saw in that last study with the ISD asking about the gun violence, or not the gun violence, the armed guards. Um, this was voluntary. People came to this event; they weren't forced to be here. So voluntary response survey is one in which people are invited to log into a website, send a text message, or call by phone in order to express their opinion. In this case, they came to an event to maybe express their opinion. So this is where you seek out expressing your opinion. In many cases, the opinions of those who participate in such surveys do not reflect those of the population as a whole. In particular, what happens is that people with strong opinions are more likely to participate. In general, volunteer response surveys are highly biased. So usually you're not going to volunteer your opinion unless you have a strong opinion. It's kind of like if you were asked about what's your opinion about rights to abortion. If you don't have a real strong sense on it, you are not going to seek out and call, the news station, or, send a text message or something like that to some survey. If you don't have a really strong opinion about it, you're just gonna be like, eh. If you're really strong opinion about it, you're like really against it, you're more likely to respond to the survey. And another example, it's a little more probably closer to home, is anytime you've reviewed something, like when you review restaurants on Yelp or you review products on Amazon, that's volunteer response bias as well. You're telling them what you think and your opinions. And usually you don't volunteer those opinions unless you had a really good experience or a really bad experience. If you go to a restaurant and it was like, it was okay, you don't usually get online and tell everybody about it. If you go to a restaurant and it was the most spectacular food you ever had, then you're more likely to say something. Self-interest bias. So this one is probably more like the vaccine one, because we have med labs and med labs is doing the report. So many advertisements contain data about their product being superior. So like all those ones about toothpaste, like 9 out of 10 does says ours is the best. That's going to be self-interest bias involved in that. The advertiser, however, may not report any data that tends to show the product is inferior. So yeah, you don't usually see something, an ad for a product and they're telling you this product is great, except for, there's one problem with it. You see that with medicines because they have to report it, but if they don't have to report it, they will not. Even more seriously is a trend for companies to pay scientists or physicians to publish results involving their products or drugs. So basically, they will buy good reviews. So they will buy a dentist who will say, "Yeah, this is the best toothpaste ever." So that is a problem as well, because you can always find somebody that's going to take the money who will say something good about your product. People who have a self-interest in the outcome of an experiment have an incentive to use biased methods. And a good example of this, and this had been a problem on Amazon especially, is that companies will actually pay for your review. And this actually happened to me once, and I've heard this happening before. I bought a product and it was I can't remember what I bought. I bought something and it broke like right away. So I went and I asked for a refund, and then I wrote this review, put this 1-star review going, yeah, I had this product, I used it once, it broke right on me, blah, 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 blah. So the company actually got a hold of me. They sent me an email and said, if you change that response to a 5-star response, we'll give you $100. So I thought, okay, well, let's see. So I went in there, I changed it. I didn't even change the review. I left the review terrible, but I put 5 stars on it, and they gave me a $100 gift card for Amazon. So that was self-interest, admittedly. I probably shouldn't have done that. I was just curious if they would really do it. But that's an example of self-interest that's a little more closer to home. A socially acceptable bias. So this would be like the one about deciding about having the armed guards. It's probably be a socially accepted bias going on there. It's more socially acceptable probably to say, yeah, I want my kids safe, so that you're more likely to vote that in front of a bunch of people. So consider the scenario when a pollster is asked, did you vote in the last election? With a direct approach, people may be reluctant to answer no out of the concern that not voting is socially less acceptable. So, it's this big thing that what you should do, it's your duty and everything to go vote. So if you don't vote, you're not likely to volunteer that information unless you have to. So social acceptable bias occurs when people are reluctant to admit to behaviors that reflects negatively on them. The characteristic of human nature affects many studies. So there's a lot of studies that are pretty funny where they ask high schoolers things like, how much do you actually drink? Do you smoke marijuana? Things like that, and expecting to get expecting to get good data on it. And there is that socially acceptable bias is part of it. And there's like, well, it's not socially acceptable for me to drink and smoke pot and other things. Also, you can get in trouble. So there's self-interest involved too. We do a lot of studies where I ask people things like that, and they're going to not tell you the truth. So they may not respond or they may lie because they want to look more socially acceptable. Leading question response. So sometimes, so we mentioned this one earlier actually, some questions are worded in a way that suggests a particular response. So for example, do you favor decreasing the heavy tax burden on the middle class? The word heavy and burden suggests that taxes are too much and would encourage a yes response. Also, that social acceptable kind of goes in there too. So these are not necessarily separate from each other. This is an example of leading question bias. So like I said, with the R1 with the armed guards, we've head off with there's an increase in school violence. So already, it's like, oh, we're in danger. Do you want an armed guard? You're more likely to go, oh yeah, I want an armed guard. If you just said, hey, you know what? We're considering having armed guards at the school. What do you think? That would have a much different outcome than when we had a leading question. Then you have that non-response bias, which we also had in the case of the armed guards. Not everybody gave a response. People cannot be forced to answer questions or to participate in studies. You can't make them do it. A certain proportion of people who are asked to participate will refuse to do so. These people are called non-responders. So their opinions of non-responders may differ from the opinions of those who don't respond. So like in the case, like I said, of the armed guard, they may have been either they weren't really sure of their opinion, therefore they didn't give one. That could be part of it. They may have been people who really didn't want there to be armed guards, but they saw all their friends vote for it and they, decided to hold back their opinion. So usually there is something systematically different from people who don't respond than from people who do respond. The other thing is like a lot of times when you send surveys out and people don't respond, a lot of people don't respond because they're busy. So they're systematically different from those who respond. So it's that systematic difference between the groups, because it's another example of that kind of goes along with that convenience sampling, where we have that systematic difference. It causes there to be bias because all those people are not responding. They're not responding for a reason, and we're missing something important in our sample, and it's not representative. So our last one is sampling bias. So this would be the vaccine one. Sampling bias occurs when some members of the population are more likely to be included in the sample than others. So in that case, we wanted to look at a vaccine, how it affected the whole population, but the people we chose were healthy people. So healthy people were more likely to be in the sample. Another example is consumer surveys are often conducted by randomly calling people from a list of phone numbers because consumers without a phone number will be omitted from the sample. Sampling bias is likely to occur. Yeah, so if you're trying to have a product in here, like let's say it's tractors and you're having, like, what do you think of this tractor? The people who have phones are going to answer, but the Amish community would not be able to answer this and tell you their opinions on tractors. They don't have phones. So you're eliminating part of your population again. It's almost impossible to avoid sampling bias completely. We do what we can. That's what simple random sampling is supposed to do, is avoid sampling bias. But it's really hard to completely, not have some sampling bias. There's just certain parts of the population that are going to be a lot harder to get information from, no matter what you're looking at. So it is important to note that there are many more than one type of bias. So anytime you have a situation, there's lots of bias can be going on. So the two examples I gave you, the one with the vaccine, we had the sample bias, we had a self-interest bias as well. When you talked about the armed guards, you had a non-response bias, you had a social acceptable bias, you would have had you would still had a sampling bias because, like I said, because you picked that certain time of day, you're missing out on part of your population. So, like, there are lots of biases that can go on. So when something is wrong, it's not one bias, it's usually a cluster of biases that you have. So we're considering the following question to parents of school children who were only 30% responded. So we have a non-response bias already. Do you support improving public schools by issuing school bonds? So what they want to know is, do you want us to issue school bonds? But they put it in this context of supporting public schools. So automatically it's a leading question because you're going, it's like, well, I have to support those school bonds if I want to improve the school. So that's, like I said, so you got non-response bias, and now you have a leading question bias. Okay. So just a couple scenarios here. So decide what types of bias are present in these scenarios. To study the effectiveness of a flu vaccine, we're going to have, oh, this is the one we already did. Sorry, we can kind of put these in here. We had talked about that. So study the effectiveness of a flu vaccine. 200 healthy volunteers were given 2 doses of MedLab's vaccine. After a year, MedLabs reported that the flu hospitalization rates had decreased for those taking the new vaccine when compared to the country's hospitalization rates for the previous year. And that should have been a possessive countries, not a plural. There's a typo there. So you have the self-interest. It's MedLabs made the vaccine, MedLabs is reporting on the vaccine. So there's definitely self-interest involved. And then you have the sampling bias. So those are the two biases we definitely have. What we need to be sampling from is everybody, but we're only sampling the healthy people. Um, sorry, that was a pre-reading. This one should be what kind of bias is there again? Put a typo in there. So kind of bias that we had in this one. So this is the school. Local ISD is debating whether they're going to have armed guards in the school. So they decide to talk to parents, have them come to an after-school meeting. So once again, sample bias. We're only getting people who can attend this meeting, and also on top of that, the people who care to attend that meeting. And then we ask a leading question: with the increased violence in schools, do you feel comfortable having armed guards? So leading question. My other bias. We voted by a raise of hands so everybody can see what everybody's doing. So there's the socially acceptable bias. And then we have a non-response bias. We also have a volunteer bias here because you had to volunteer to come to the event. We have pretty much almost all our biases all in this question here. The only thing we're missing really, well, it's to be debated, but self-interest is what the only one that may not be in here. Like I said, you can have tons and tons of different kinds of bias in just one study. We have one of the things we always like to do is when we do samples is we like to have large sample sizes because large sample sizes does help with some kinds of bias, but doesn't necessarily eliminate it for us. So a sample is useful only if it's drawn by a method that is likely to represent the population well. So if you did a simply random sample and you made it a very large sample, it's less likely to have bias. It doesn't mean it's all gone altogether though. So if you see a biased method, draw a sample, then drawing a bigger sample is not going to help. So if you're already biased, like the 200 healthy people, if I go and I go, well, maybe to avoid bias, we'll look at 2,000 healthy people. It doesn't matter because the bias was already set in the minute you decided to only sample healthy people. So collecting bigger samples is not going to really make up for biases. So, for example, volunteer response surveys that draw several hundred people to participate, although the sample is very large, it is unlikely to represent the population well. So, it's still the results are meaningless because still, when it's volunteer, you're still getting people with strong opinions. You're just getting more people with strong opinions. Okay, so just an example 80,000 people attending a professional football game filled out surveys asking their opinion on using tax money to upgrade the football stadium. 70% said that they supported the use of the tax money. Then a pollster surveyed a random sample of 500 voters, and only 30% of them, of those sampled, supported using the tax money for the stadium. The owner of the football stadium claimed that the survey done in the football stadium is more reliable because the sample size is larger. Is he right? No. The pollster is more likely to be correct because it was a simply random sample of 500 voters. Granted, there's probably going to be still a little bit of bias in there because can't guarantee that everybody actually responded, but it's got to be better than the other one because you're talking about a sample of people who like football, asking them, should we spend money on football? And then you have everybody else and going, should we spend money on football? So even though the stadium is a larger sample, it's got a severe sampling bias to it and a self interest bias as well.